Hey residents, welcome back to Hotel Earth 360. I'm Lexi.
And I'm Ari.
I want to start us today with a number. Well, sort of. I guess it is a number if you do the math, but in this current form, it's a fraction.
All right. Hit us.
1/3.
That's it. That's descriptive. Okay. 1/3 of what?
1/3 of all of the food produced on Earth never gets eaten. It is grown, harvested, transported, packaged, refrigerated, and then tossed or left to rot in a field or discarded at a store because it didn't look perfect. 1/3 gone. And at the same time,
And at the same time, roughly 783 million people go to bed hungry. Ironically, a third of humanity faces food insecurity. And in America, the land of prosperity or whatever, millions live in communities where they cannot reliably access fresh, nutritious food.
right, and diet-related illness, think diabetes, heart disease, obesity, is one of the leading drivers of death and healthcare costs, at least in the United States. The people most affected are almost always the people with the least power to change it. And as we're going to talk about today, that's not a coincidence. That is a design outcome.
Yep. Today's episode is all about that design, about the systems, whether that be economic, political, geographic, and historical, that produced the food world that we're currently living in. We're going to talk about who gets to eat well and who doesn't, and why. We're going to talk about who owns the land that food is grown on, and how centuries of injustice have shaped that answer. We're going to talk about the environmental cost of how we move food around the planet. And yes, we're going to address the waste problem because it simply needs to be called out, clearly.
This is not a comfortable episode, but it is an important one because you can't fix an issue that you aren't informed of.
And we will leave you with somewhere to put all of this. That's the Hotel Earth promise.
Let's get into it.
Hi, we'd like to extend our stay.
And upgrade. Before we can talk about what's broken, we need to make sure we're all focused on the same thing. The food system, air quotes, is one of those phrases that is going to be thrown around a lot in this episode, and we have definitely tossed it around in previous episodes. So we're starting today with a clear definition so we're all on the same page. A food system is everything that happens between a seed going into the ground and it entering the human body. Not the seed, but, the thing that grows from the seed. It also includes, for the purposes of our conversation, everything that happens after, including growing, processing, packaging, transporting, retailing, cooking, eating, wasting. I think that's everything. It includes the policies that govern farmland and the subsidies that shape what gets grown. It includes the grocery store 3 miles from your house. It includes the shipping container crossing the Pacific and the farm in China growing your green beans for a supermarket in London.
Make it make sense.
It's a lot.
Food systems, yeah, it is. Food systems operate at multiple scales simultaneously. There's the hyper-local scale, a community garden, a backyard plot, a school garden that grows food for its own kitchen. There's the regional scale, think farmers markets, community-supported agriculture programs, regional food hubs and distribution networks. And then there's the national scale: grocery supply chains, commodity markets, federal nutrition programs like SNAP. And then the big kahuna, there's the global scale: imported superfoods, exported grain, multinational agribusiness corporations whose annual revenues exceed the GDP of many countries. Each of these scales has its own logic, its own incentives, its own environmental footprint, and they are all connected. A policy decision made in Washington about corn subsidies ripples out to what a farmer in Iowa can afford to grow, which ripples out to what ends up in a grocery store in a low-income neighborhood in Detroit, which ripples out to health of the people who live there. That is what a system means. Everything is connected. It's a web. And when a system is designed, even implicitly, without anyone explicitly intending it, to prioritize some people over others, the effects move through every level and every community.
Yeah, that gives me the chills. No one is safe here. The central questions that we're asking today are these: who does the system actually serve? And second, who does it leave behind? Now, I want to name attention up front because I think it's important to be honest from the start. Eating locally, eating seasonally, buying from farmers markets, choosing organics. These things are genuinely better for the environment in many cases. Ari and I have talked about it. We've suggested it. We still encourage you to do it. However, there are also choices that we haven't named yet that require time, money, transportation access, and often a baseline of nutritional knowledge that not everyone has had an equal opportunity to develop. And farmers markets and CSAs are wonderful, but they are also, in many communities, completely inaccessible. That gap is not an accident. It is a consequence and product of how we have built our cities, our transit systems, our food retail infrastructure, and our economic policies. And it is the gap that we're going to spend the most of today actually examining.
Tucker Garrison, who runs Imlakesh Organics and sources food from small farmers around the world, pushed back on one of the most common assumptions in food conversations. Listen in. That is that local is always better and imported is always worse. All right, let's unpack this. The reality, he explained, is much more complicated. Where food comes from and the CO2 it takes to transport it is only one factor in its environmental footprint. How it was grown, under what conditions, using what inputs, these things matter enormously. And sometimes a product grown regeneratively by a small farmer in another country and shipped to the US can have a smaller total footprint than a product grown industrially 50 miles away. That complexity is worth acknowledging.
The movement from doing good to regenerative requires a holistic understanding of like the living system of like all the pieces that are moving. Because how do I say this? You have to, when it's done well, you have to fully step out of what you want, right? It no longer has anything to do with me being like, oh, I want to run a successful company, or oh, I want to produce, this much sacha inchi per acre. It's like, oh, like the living system dictates like this is its highest potential. And the only question is like, are you an instrument and a vehicle for this place, this culture, this ecosystem to reach its highest potential? If you're doing that, you're working regeneratively, right? You're working within the living systems framework of what it is. And sometimes we're successful at that and sometimes we're not. But, I would argue we spend a lot of time in the doing good paradigm.
All right, folks, let's talk about food deserts. And I want to offer this term deliberately, food apartheid. A food desert is defined, technically, as a geographic area where residents have limited access to affordable, nutritious food. In urban areas, that's typically defined as living more than 1 mile from a supermarket. In rural areas, that's 10 miles. So by that definition, millions of Americans live in food deserts right now. not just Americans, millions of people,
People.
millions of humans. But just to make it a little clearer to you, listener, well, I guess we have listeners from all over. But anyways, point is, that definition misses a key component of this reality, however. A desert is a natural condition. It suggests that the absence of healthy food in a neighborhood is somehow inevitable, geological even. It's nobody's fault. It's just like, something we have to deal with from time to time. Minor inconveniences.
What biome
No.
do you live in? Oh, a food desert.
I live in the marshmallow rainforest. I wish. No. Food apartheid describes a systemic, human-created framework of racialized segregation that denies BIPOC and low-income communities access to nutritious, affordable food while promoting food abundance in wealthier, wider areas. It's that simple. This term, coined by activist Karen Washington, replaces food desert, in quotes, to highlight that food access inequities are rooted in historical injustices like redlining, systemic racism, and discriminatory economic policies. This is not a natural condition. Might be, what's the word I'm looking for? Intentional, might be done with intention, but it's not natural. It is the result of deliberate decisions. Decisions about where to build grocery stores and where not to, about where to site fast food chains, about how to zone neighborhoods, about which communities are worth investing in and which ones aren't. Grace Johnson, an urban farmer, educator, and food justice advocate who has worked in communities across California, including Stockton and Woodland, was direct about this when we spoke with her.
Despite them being different contexts, there's so much overlap, and I think that speaks to the greater issue and the systemic, just kind of how the system is built and maintained just shows that people in all kinds of communities will not have access to a grocery store within a reasonable amount of distance or a place that you can take public transit to. The food there isn't fresh. The people are struggling with their health because they can't get enough fresh fruits and vegetables in their diet. I think affordability is usually the biggest issue with all of that too, but also the quality.
What Grace is describing is not an edge case. It is the lived reality of millions of people, and the question of food access is inseparable from the question of city planning, of how far a grocery store is from a given neighborhood, whether you can get there by walking or public transit, whether the prices inside are ones you can afford, and whether the food on the shelves actually reflects your cultural identity and traditions, which is something that I think definitely does not get enough amplification.
Doesn't.
And that last point matters more than it might seem. Food is not just calories, it is culture, it is memory, it is identity. And when the only affordable options in your neighborhood are highly processed foods that bear no relationship to your family's traditions, something beyond nutrition is being lost. And the health consequences of this are not subtle. Communities with limited access to fresh, nutritious food show higher rates of diabetes, like we talked about at the top of the episode, obesity, heart disease, depression, and anxiety. These are not moral failures of the individuals. They are predictable outcomes for a system that has systemically underinvested in certain communities for generations. And this connects directly to what we talked about in episode 2. Research published in a peer review literature suggested that food grown using regenerative practices has measurably more nutrition profiles than food grown industrially on degraded soil. We've talked about that. But this means that communities least likely to have access to regeneratively grown food are also now bearing the greatest health burden from the degraded industrial food that is available to them.
Exactly. Grace used a phrase that lives in my mind rent free. Food is a right. It's a right, not a reward for having enough money or living in the right zip code, a right. And when we treat it as anything less than that, when we design systems that make nutritious food reliably available to some and not to others, we are making a choice, a political choice, a moral choice. That's what we mean when we say food is politics. Grace also framed why these impacts matter beyond the communities most immediately affected. She described food deserts or food apartheid communities as a canary in the coal mine, a signal to the rest. What is happening in under-resourced communities today in terms of food access and diet-related health outcomes is an early warning of what happens to all communities when food systems fail. When healthy food becomes a luxury item, a divide opens up. It starts with geography and income, but over time, as climate change disrupts supply chains, as industrial soil degradation reduces yields, as costs of food production rise, that divide widens. People with more resources will insulate themselves, but the majority of people, those people with fewer resources, are simply left exposed. Food apartheid is not just a justice issue. It is a warning about the fragility of the entire system.
Oh man. Oh man. Oh man. Yeah, climate change affects every step of the agricultural process. It affects inputs you need to put into the ground and how much water you're using. It can affect transportation. I feel like transportation and that kind of moving this produce from one place to another can largely be impacted, especially by weather. I think weather is the biggest thing. The weather being unpredictable and like weather already is like becoming really unpredictable and we see like, oh, it's gonna rain today. Oh, it didn't. And so if you plan for it to rain and you didn't water your crops because you're expecting the rains, oh no, you're stressing out the plants. If you're if the weather's so bad that you can't drive the produce from point A to point B where it needs to be, that produce could all go bad. If the roads are slick and the it was unsuspecting, roads are slick, the truck tips over, all the produce is gone. If a blackout happens and all of your food's in cold storage, the produce is gone. It's things like that that like it happens, it happens, mistakes get made. We have things happen. If those happen more frequently, that's really, really bad. That's super, super bad. And especially for people that are in the fields, those weather events that are going to be so much more extreme as time goes on, predictably. And we're already seeing now with extreme heat and extreme rain, it's inhumane. It's inhumane to expect people to work in these conditions that can put your life at risk and your health at risk. And people like we even saw in California just how the toll of working through wildfire smoke it took on farm workers. And everywhere where it's getting really hot or staying really hot for longer periods of time, we see the effects that that has. And we can't expect, we see kind of this trend of people not really wanting to be farm workers or not wanting to be in this field of a career in agriculture because it's arduous. It takes a lot of energy, and a lot of people that are working in the fields especially are people that don't really have other prospects or are choosing something that is connected to the earth and are willing to not take the fair livable wages. It's it's a huge equity issue. It's a huge justice issue, and ultimately climate change will make it so that nobody wants to be outside working these fields. And I don't think we can rely solely on indoor greenhouse agriculture to feed the billions of people we have on this planet. There's so many ways that food insecurity can look. It can look like not having access to the only grocery store you have access to is maybe a corner store. It can look like not having time to go to the grocery store before or after work for a long time and resorting to eating out a lot, which is already more expensive, but based on your lifestyle and your work schedule, you have to make do. Sometimes that means not eating because you don't have time. That can also look like finding food that most people maybe otherwise wouldn't eat. And so it can make you really resourceful. But at the same time, a lot of people that are experiencing food insecurity are not getting, pretty much in every case, are not getting enough nourishment in general, which leads to a myriad of issues.
Let's be clear about something before we move on. We are not talking about individual choices here. It is easy and politically convenient to frame food access as a matter of personal responsibility, to say some people should just make better choices about what they eat, that they should all pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But those options don't really exist when you live in a neighborhood where the closest grocery store is an hour away by bus, where the fresh produce that is available costs twice what you can afford, when you're working two jobs and you don't have time to cook from scratch, and where the cheap, calorie dense, heavily processed food is the option that is available, affordable, and, Maisie, lest we forget, engineered to be appealing.
Yeah.
The choices,
That.
the choices available in the industrial food system are not neutral. It is designed to produce certain outcomes. Sorry if I sound like a broken record. And changing those outcomes requires changing the system, not lecturing people about their grocery lists.
Lex, you brought up the issue of identity when examining our food options. I'd like to expand on that for a moment because food access asks, do you have enough to eat? But food sovereignty asks something a little different. It asks, do you have a say in what you eat? Do you have agency over your food system, over your food? Does the food available to you reflect your community's values, culture, and needs? Food sovereignty is defined as a community's right to define what their food system looks like, to have democratic agency over what is grown, how it's distributed, what it costs, and whether it reflects the identity of the people it serves. And here's why it matters so much. Access without sovereignty is not enough. Here's Grace speaking on this point.
Yes, food sovereignty is like the bread and butter. Like food sovereignty is this notion that the communities being served are involved in the process. The communities that want certain foods have a say in what foods they receive, what the systems look like. They get to be a part of it in whatever shape or form they want to be. It's very democratic. It's very, this is, the food is life, and the food is life, and we get to decide what that looks like. What do we want to fill us with life? And that can mean an array of things. That can be, we don't want synthetic pesticides. We want to prioritize regenerative growth and providing more life into the soil. Is this making people happier? Because I believe that food that nourishes you makes you happier. Truly, food sovereignty is allowing people to have that agency to have what they need and have a voice in this process that is integral to everything.
What Grace is describing, needs assessment, community input, and culturally appropriate food, is what food sovereignty looks like in practice. That description doesn't really reflect how most food system decisions, though, are actually made. Like, instead, they're made by corporations optimizing for profit, by city
Yeah.
planners optimizing for efficiency, or by policymakers who are rarely members of the communities most affected. Like, yeah, you're elected within your district, but that doesn't mean you're actually living in the neighborhood
Yeah.
that gets the brunt of the stick, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
There are examples of disruptors of the current model. Here is Cole, a steward to a farmland on the California coast, describing that land as a model for localized food, power, and water sovereignty.
Well, I think the first thing that really needs to be said in response to your question is that people facing food insecurity are that food insecurity is an engineered social problem. It is not a natural order of things. It is engineered by corporate consolidation of our food system, by the state, and by apparatuses that maintain control through controlling our food system. And that's been true for the entirety of the history of this country and many others. And so, for example, when white European settlers came to Turtle Island, what is known as the United States, one of their first methods of war and control of the indigenous population was to eliminate the buffalo. And that was a key strategic point in the genocide against indigenous peoples. And we can also look to Palestine and to Gaza, where the food system of the Palestinian people is being systematically destroyed and systematically uprooted, literally uprooting of olive trees, of herding, grazing lands. And all of this is done as a means of control. So, and as a means of maintaining power and state power. And so, food is a means of political and spiritual and material control over peoples. And so, food scarcity is engineered, it is designed, and it is implemented by violent systems. So, abundance in that context, when we understand that, abundance is the rights and the sovereignty of people to determine their own food systems. And more, perhaps just as importantly, the rights and sovereignty of people to be able to embody and express their true culture and their true spirit, which is to say, their birthright as human beings on this planet, a dignified life in connection with the earth, in connection with all of the relatives, all of the beings that we co evolved with, as you pointed out earlier. Um, and so to me, yeah, abundance is actually about relationship. It's about being able to attend to our relations in a dignified way that ennobles our spirit. And when we do that, when we are allowed to do that, abundance naturally flows from the attending to our relations, because we are embedded within a web, highly complex and beautiful web of relationships. And when we give our attention and our devotion to those relations, and we are allowed to do so, then a natural abundance pours forth. I mean, very simply, food sovereignty as determined by a congress, a people's congress, a people's assembly of farmers and fisher folk in Nayeli in Mali, in Africa. There was a great gathering of farmers and fisher folk, and they came together from across the world to decide, to come together to talk about what food sovereignty is. And they said in the Declaration of Nayeleni that food sovereignty is the rights of people to grow, distribute, and determine their own food systems that is in alignment with their cultures and with the dignity of their peoples and their territories. And food security is a much narrower um, framework that's often been peddled by groups like the United Nations or the World Bank or other large, um, organizations, and that framework is based much more quantitatively on calories or number of pounds of food. It's linked in with state apparatuses that distribute large quantities of cheaply produced grains and proteins, often from the United States, which are forms of soft power that the United States wields in other countries. And so there's a whole nefarious history to the idea of food security, again, as a form of control, as a way of flooding foreign markets with cheap American grains in order to control the market and then raise the prices, and other very nefarious and complex kind of market schemes like that that are rooted in food system control. So food security has been used as a blanket or as a propaganda or as a whitewashing to enact those kinds of systems. Food sovereignty, and we all, I mean, I think we can all touch in with the part of ourselves who, when we go to the grocery store and we see the sort of false choices that we're given by the corporate food system, when we see that despite all the colors and labels, it's the same, 7 corporations that are making 95% of the food in a safe way, or um, we actually can touch in with the reality that or when the COVID-19 pandemic happened and shelves were going empty, and people touched in with the reality of the fragility of their actual agency. I think it's in moments like that where you can intuitively understand the difference between food sovereignty and food security. And that in a world controlled by corporate greed and the desecration of what is sacred, we will never have true sovereignty. We will only have security as defined by those very same entities that are undermining our true security.
And as a reminder, here are Grace and Tucker to tell us about how nature works.
I think most people misunderstand all of the costs and all of the labor and all of the processes that are involved with getting your produce that you buy in the store that looks super beautiful from the land, the seed to your plate. How many people have touched it? How many people had to order things online to be here? A lot of farms can't even save their own seeds if they're patented. There's so much there's so much drama in the food industry. I'm sure we all know. And who harvested this food? Who packaged it? Who delivered it to the store? Who oversaw and looked at everything and picked out the ones that didn't look pretty or got destroyed in process? There's so much you don't see before you see the food in the grocery store or get it delivered to your house, which I'm still like, oh my God, we can get groceries delivered to our house now. Like, whoa, the future. But even then, it's like, then that additional person touches that food that now is in your house, and you're just like, whoa, yeah, there's so much going on that's gotten me from hungry to food in my doorstep. It's completely bonkers. There is this expectation that there's always going to be food waiting for you or produce waiting for you at the store, and it's going to be beautiful, beautifully packaged, blemish free. Everything's uniform, and I don't think people understand how difficult it is to streamline that process so that everything looks like it was basically grown in a lab. Because I know I remember talking to you, Lexi, about how we kind of expect the world to operate like a machine, and it just doesn't. Nature is metal. Nature is like hardcore, and the more we try and tame nature, the more it kind of attacks us. And it's just like, yo, stop. Don't do that. Like like when you say I'm a force of nature, we're saying like this thing is powerful and you cannot just like take over and think that you are mightier than it when also bringing it back, we are nature. We are that force of nature. Like, hello, we are so powerful.
Let's talk about where we are for a second, which is that in this moment, the what I want to call like the mainstream paradigm of industrial agriculture And one of the other things I'd encourage us to use in our language is we need to move away from the idea that there's conventional agriculture and organic agriculture, right? Conventional meaning normal. There's nothing normal about what's happening in conventional agriculture. It's 100 years old, 120 years old, and it's a highly abnormal way of producing food. So I will refer to it as industrial agriculture or petrochemical agriculture, right? So if we imagine like what does this system look like? And again, I'm oversimplifying. Industrial agriculture and this kind of hyper masculine approach to agriculture is all about controlling as many variables as possible. So what do I mean by that? Imagine a 10,000 acre field that's perfectly flat, full of genetically modified corn, where there's not a single weed, there's not a single plant, there's not a single insect, that the entirety of all of that corn is growing within 1 inch of height of every other grain of corn in that field, right? There's no real soil. It's like there's like a sponge we call earth, but actually we're dumping industrial nitrogen fertilizer from far away outside inputs onto that land, then genetically modifying it so that it doesn't die when you spray herbicides on it, which kill plants. And then you take Roundup, right? And like what Bayer and Monsanto and all these companies are doing and spraying those things on the land. Now, of course, all of that, when it rains or when they irrigate it, it runs off into the waterways, right? So they know there's a connection beyond those 10,000 acres, but they want to avoid the idea that that's happening, right? And they know that all the things that they're doing are reliant on outside inputs that are coming from far away in order to make that happen, including a lot of oil and gas production, right? How a lot of these petrochemicals are made. So when we think about the paradigm of what's happening, some people call that progress. Some people celebrate that. And I'm open to sitting here and being convinced why this is a good idea. To this day, I mean, truly, like I remain open, but I have yet to be presented with a viewpoint that says that like this hyper masculine, technocratic, like worldview, which is really based in like the foundation of like kind of the scientific method, right? Which is how can we remove all possible variables to make it so that we can like repeat this thing over and over and over and over again. But what it requires is the destruction of the entirety of the rest of the ecology of the planet. You have to avoid the idea that it rains. You have to avoid the idea that there are blights, there are viruses, there are, locusts, there are, whatever it may be. And of course, it's a folly to think that we can continue doing this and that it's going to work.
Nature is metal. Genre of music? Rock.
Wait, that was a periodic table joke, right? Like, you mean like elements or whatever?
Ladies and gentlemen, Lexi, a Bachelor of Science recipient.
Ma'am, let's get one thing clear. You are the scientist here. I am just doing my best.
And you are doing wonderfully, ma'am. Now, mixed into this is a profound and underreported threat to food sovereignty. That is the patenting of seeds. For most of human agricultural history, seeds were saved. A farmer would harvest a crop, set aside the best seeds, and plant them the following season. This practice, called seed saving, is the foundation of agricultural biodiversity. It's how crops adapt to local conditions over multiple generations. It's how indigenous communities developed so many of the varieties of corn, potato, bean, and squash suited to specific climates. It is also how enslaved people brought sorghum, millet, yams, and okra to America. So yeah, seed saving is, in a very real sense, the original form of food sovereignty. Over the last several decades, biotechnology corporations have developed genetically modified seed varieties and, crucially, patented them. Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, is the most prominent example. When a farmer plants a patented seed, they are legally prohibited from saving and replanting it. They must purchase new seeds each year from the corporation that owns the patent. And because these patented varieties have often been engineered to work specifically with certain herbicides, also sold by the same corporation, by the way, your conspiracy theory tin hat should be on, just saying. Farmers become dependent on an entire package of proprietary inputs.
Yeah. Let's put a small pin here for the people who are going to be in the comments like, yeah, but GMOs do make it possible for seeds to grow in certain conditions. Not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like put that on the back shelf. Grace connected this to something that might seem more mundane, but is actually part of the same story. And that is the standardization of what our food looks like. Grocery chains demand uniformity. The same size apple, the same shaped tomato, the same color pepper. And that's because it makes logistics easier, but it also makes the shelves look more appealing. That demand for uniformity, the demand for uniformity ripples back through the supply chain, selecting for varieties that ship well or look good over certain varieties and that taste better. And also, like, I'm not saying that things that taste good shouldn't be prioritized, but the more nutritious or like there are things that are more nutritious that aren't as pretty or that are better adapted to the local growing conditions that aren't being prioritized because of this uniformity. And Grace reminded us that when we lose out on this, it's like we actually lose out on small farms. We lose out on then the community trust, the connection between farmers and the communities they are actually a part of, and the ability to know and visit where your food comes from. And this result is a narrowing, which can be seen in the number of seed varieties available at the grocery store and devastatingly in the biological diversity that makes our food system resilient.
We cannot talk about food equity without talking about land. It would make no sense. Like, who owns the land determines who profits from food production. It's that simple. It determines who has the ability to farm regeneratively, who gets to pass agricultural knowledge down through generations, and whose relationship with a specific piece of earth gets honored and whose gets erased. In the United States, land ownership is shaped profoundly by centuries of dispossession, exclusion, and broken promises. We want to be direct about this because it is easy to talk about food systems in abstract terms that obscure the very specific historical choices that produce them. But let's start with Black farmers. At the end of the Civil War, formerly enslaved people were promised land. 40 acres and a mule, a phrase which has become almost cliched at this point. This is a tragedy because what it actually represents is a promise that was made and then systematically broken almost immediately. That broken promise set a trajectory. In the early 20th century, there were nearly 1 million Black farmers in the United States. They owned around 16 million acres of farmland. And today, fewer than 50,000 Black farmers remain. That is less than 2% of all U.S. farmers. That collapse did not happen by accident. The USDA, the agency charged with supporting American farmers, has a thoroughly documented history of discriminatory lending and loan forgiveness practices. Black farmers were systematically denied the operating loans, disaster relief payments, and farm ownership support that white farmers received as a matter of course. Applications were delayed, lost, or rejected on pretextual grounds. Appeals were ignored. Farms were lost due to foreclosure while the paperwork sat in a county office.
And it's really disturbing that this story reminds me, at least, of what occurred to Native Americans on the same land, not in the so distant past. Like, the story for Native American communities is distinct and foundational to the American land question, because it begins not with discrimination within a system, but with the violent dispossession that built the system in the first place. So it's almost no wonder that it was altered, obviously,
Yeah.
but it was repeated and gets repeated. But indigenous communities across North America were removed from the lands they had stewarded for thousands of years. Land whose fertility, in many cases, if not probably most cases, was a direct product of this stewardship. The agricultural knowledge embedded in these communities included knowledge of which plants grew where, how to manage water, how to maintain soil health across generations, and when the relationship with the land was severed, a kind of knowledge that took millennia to develop began to disappear rapidly. Today, tribal nations hold land in complex and often restrictive arrangements, such as federal land trusts, that even limit what can be done with them and make management incredibly difficult. Attached to this are the ongoing legal disputes over water rights, which are inseparable from agricultural viability. And there are federal initiatives aimed at supporting native farmers, but the gap between policy acknowledgement and genuine land restitution, as in the gap between saying we recognize this history and actually changing the conditions it produced, remains enormous. Organizations like NATIVS, the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, are doing extraordinary work to revitalize indigenous food traditions and establish food sovereignty from the ground up. Organizations like this deserve support, and we will be sure to link them in the show notes. Now, let's zoom out for a moment from the community level to the planetary level, because the way we move food around the world has an environmental cost that most of us haven't really considered. Ari, you have probably heard the term food miles. Yes?
Indeed, I have. It refers to the distance food travels from where it's grown to where it's eaten. Most of the time, folks bring this term up in relation to a food's carbon footprint.
Right. But food miles, as a metric, is actually more misleading than it is useful, because it's a case study in how a simple, appealing idea can actually obscure the complexity we need to understand.
Recall Tucker's earlier comparison that large-scale ocean shipping is a less impactful way to move food than trucking almonds from California to the East Coast. The core principle there, transportation is a relatively small fraction of food's total carbon footprint. Production methods matter far more. What Tucker is pointing to is something researchers have confirmed. Transportation typically accounts for a relatively small percentage of food's total carbon footprint. The bigger factors are almost always in production: how the food was grown, what inputs were used, how the land was managed, whether the farming practices sequestered or released carbon. A tomato grown in a heated greenhouse in England might have a significantly larger carbon footprint than one shipped from Spain, even though the Spanish tomato technically traveled further. Recall from last week, a grass-fed beef from a regenerative ranch might have a very different footprint profile than a feedlot raised equivalent raised just down the road. Okay, so TLDR, this means that buy local is not a complete answer to the environmental question or the ethical one.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the right answer, and a lot of the times it is, but sometimes it isn't. And we need to be aware of these things. The only way to know is to look at the full picture. Here is Tucker on this again.
In many ways, like my description of like the agricultural system, which is like this like highly hyper masculine, very reductionist, very repeatable system of growing food. The carbon footprint model is like, how can we like wedge ecology into like capitalism, just like stuff it in there? It's like this thing that's they're trying to like measure and quantify and standardize and yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, but again, it's a great idea that was developed by ecologists, which has been to some extent, not fully, been co-opted by capitalism and greed as another way to just like grow people's wealth and or justify the destruction of things that shouldn't be destroyed, right? Like cap and trade and
Yep. Yep. Or even put the blame on someone else. When I think of the word carbon footprint a lot, for example, it makes me think like, what's my personal carbon footprint rather than what's a company's carbon footprint.
That all said, global food supply chains do carry real environmental costs, and those extend well beyond carbon. And I want to also just point out that part of what Tucker specifically was speaking about with ocean transportation is eventually transitioning to sail-based transportation. So relying on the winds, not on fossil fuels, to transport things across the ocean, which would obviously have a profound impact on the quote-unquote carbon of it all.
Right.
But let's name a few things besides carbon specifically that impact the environmental global supply chain. The first is packaging. The industrial food system runs on single-use plastic. For more on that, you can go listen to season 1 of Hotel Earth. But plastic, while it protects the quality and extends shelf life and makes logistics easier, none of those things are necessarily small. I'm not trying to poo-poo them. It generates staggering quantities of waste that do not biodegrade and that contaminate oceans, waterways, and despite decades of recycling campaigns, are recycled in practice at extremely low rates. The recycling symbol in your food packaging is largely aspirational. Like, some places don't even recycle all kinds of plastic, so take that factor into account. But the most plastic food packaging, TLDR, ends up in a landfill.
She said it. If you need more information on that, go listen to the plastic season of Hotel Earth. But other than packaging, there's also refrigeration. Now, I feel like refrigeration was sort of like talked about more in the past, and we sort of got away from discussing this as a really big environmental cost. Keeping food cold across long supply chains requires enormous amounts of energy. This is one of the reasons Drawdown ranks refrigerant management as one of the highest impact climate interventions available.
And lastly, and probably pretty importantly here, there's overproduction. The system deliberately produces more than is needed to ensure the shelves are always full. See our points earlier. And supply disruptions are basically absorbed by, or like that's why they overproduce, so that when there is a disruption, you can continue shipping as usual. And that consumer demand is met. Like, they factor in the overproduction to sort of quell these arguably smaller problems. And this is a structural component that is probably one of the main drivers of food waste.
Food waste, but also some of those horrific production standards and like conditions as well. Like I just got transported back to like the egg crisis. When did that happen? Like last year?
Yeah.
When there were literally no eggs and everyone was just like freaking out.
My grocery store was like,
anyway.
1 carton of eggs per household. And I'm like, guys, just don't eat eggs.
I'm like, look, there's obviously a disruption in the system, and your freak out demand is literally why I'm not blaming anyone specifically. I'm just saying, like, the reason we have this kind of overproduction demand from the system is because there's a cry for demand from the consumer. Grace put her finger on something relevant to this point. Responsibility for the environmental cost of the food system cannot rest wholly on the consumer.
We waste a third of the food that we produce in the US, sometimes more. That's a third of our food grown and labor used and even transported that just never gets to go inside the bodies and nurture the population. That to me is so wrong. That's so wrong, and that's so frustrating, and it makes me feel so helpless where I'm like, how have we not figured out how to have systems that work? And like, why is food going bad in people's fridges immediately? Why is food moldy in the grocery store? Why are all these things always seemingly wrong and broken? And what can we really do other than be more conscious of our food purchases? And having it be this responsibility on the consumer is just simply not the way to solve this. Oh gosh, now I'm getting myself caught in this rabbit hole of like, oh my God, what do we do? But truly, there are the systemic issues, and the systemic issues is city planning even.
This is a city planning problem. It is a transit infrastructure problem. It is a food retail investment problem. It's a policy problem. It's a community-specific problem. And solving it requires engaging at those levels, not just adjusting individual shopping habits. Yes, those matter. Those matter, but this onion is layered, baby.
Okay, let's circle back to something that we talked about at the beginning and a little bit sprinkled throughout here, and that's waste. Food waste is one of those topics that has been turned very successfully into an individual responsibility issue.
Yep.
Compost your scraps. Don't let your leftovers go bad. Plan your meals. And yes, those things do matter. Like, I'm going to tell you right now, yeah, compost your scraps. Don't let your leftovers go bad. Plan your meals.
We still advocate for those things here.
Yes, we do. But food waste in America is not primarily a problem of individual carelessness. It is a systemic failure that operates at every level of the supply chain. And until we understand it that way, we will keep addressing symptoms at the individual level while ignoring the actual cause of the problem.
Exactly. Let's start with the numbers so we can all conceptualize this glacier. The USDA estimates that between 30 and 40% of the US food supply is wasted annually. Moment of silence. Marinate with that number for just a second. Okay, guys, 30 to 40%. To put that in perspective, if we saved that wasted food, all 100 billion pounds of it, we could feed every food insecure person in the United States. Per person, we are wasting approximately 325 pounds of food annually. That is around a pound per day, per person, every single day. And there are environmental consequences to this wasting. One is that when food rots in a landfill, it produces methane. Wow, shock. Which is, over a 20-year period, approximately 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Isn't that fun? The EPA has calculated that food waste in American landfills generates the same greenhouse gas emissions as 42 coal-fired power plants.
Where this waste actually comes from is not just the forgotten leftovers in the back of your fridge.
Thank you. Thank you. Someone had to say it.
Like, yeah,
Jeez.
it do be part of that, but
It's,
a
I mean,
significant
it's part, but
it's part, but it's not the whole or the majority. A significant portion
tell us where the whole
of
or the
food waste-
majority comes from.
Yeah, it happens before food ever leaves the farm, or it happens
Exactly.
when it doesn't meet cosmetics standards.
Yep.
Like in the farm context, if it's not appealing, it probably gets left to rot and then plowed over. And food loss can arise from problems, like I said, during drying, milling, transporting, or even processing that happens to expose the food product to damage by insects, rodents, birds, molds, bacteria. Spoilage in
Oh.
transit, our refrigeration issue, is a persistent problem, particularly for fresh produce. The longer the supply chain, the more opportunities for loss. And in the retail context, grocery stores deliberately overstock. Why? Psychology. Shelves that look full sell more than shelves that look sparse. But the consequence of always full shelves is discarded surplus. And yes, some waste happens at home. People buy with intentions that they don't follow through on. Lord, I am guilty of that. Produce goes bad before it gets cooked. Leftovers sit in the fridge, forgotten. We've all been there.
We have. And Grace has worked on trying to eliminate some of these problems, some of this waste. She found, and we'd likely all agree, that people generally don't want to waste food. And that's so true. Like, when do you actually actively feel good about that happening? When has that ever happened? The waste is often a product of circumstance, running out of energy to cook after a long day, produce that goes bad faster than expected, portion sizes calibrated for a different life than the one you're actually living. These are structural conditions, not character flaws.
That job I was working at a health clinic, a lot of what they were trying to do was close the loop. That's kind of the language that's used, is closing the loop. It's like knowing that you received this food, you ate this food, there are parts of that food that you couldn't eat. Where does it go? It shouldn't go in the landfill. Food that goes into the landfill releases methane, and the amount of food that we waste, a third of our food produced is in the landfill. I'm sure some scientist out there will give some nice numbers. But that's about the same amount as like 42 like coal powered energy who's and what's. That's an insane amount of energy. Like the coal's doing the carbon dioxide emissions, horrible. Methane is more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of emissions. That's insane. That's insane work, y'all. That's crazy. So closing that loop means anything that you don't consume, you can kind of put back into the system. We can't live our lives on Earth in a linear system. We need to have it be this loop that feeds into itself and produces, consumes, is reborn. We just need that kind of system to be what we strive for. We need that. We can't just treat the earth like a commodity, basically. And we do that so much. And we treat people like commodities. We treat so much like commodities. And that's ultimately what leads to all of the injustices that we experience, is devaluing life, earth, all of that. And so vermicompost just means worms. It kind of sounds like vermin, which is kind of gross, but yeah, vermicompost is the composting with the use of specifically worms. And worms are great. They aerate the soil. They eat the foods. Honestly, I'm still kind of confused as to like how worms eat and stuff. They kind of are like freaky. But their worm castings, basically their poop, is so nutritious and adds so much soil organic matter. And the model that we implemented was either patients or staff could get food from the garden, and whatever they couldn't eat or didn't eat, they would put in a bag and ideally put in their freezer so that it didn't like smell, and then bring it back to the clinic whenever they came back. And we would put it in the worms or in our hot compost pile, which just means it's active, meaning we're like really involved. There's cold compost and hot compost, and one's more passive, one's more involved. It's so rewarding when you see this process happening, because then you're like, oh my gosh, like this was once an apple or a banana and now it's just brown soil. Now it's just, and it's almost like black soil. It's so deep, it's so rich, so full of nutrients. And then we get to put that on the new plants that we're growing. And then, oh my gosh, you just grew food with old food. And that's so cool.
Let's harp on Grace's comment about closing the loop. In a genuinely sustainable food system, organic matter that isn't eaten returns to the soil. That's where it belongs. Compost takes food scraps, not the landfill, and transforms them into the biological foundation for new food. This is the cycle completing itself.
Grace put a frame around this that I keep returning to, treating Earth like a commodity. And we heard the same thing from Zion and Cole during our interview with them as well. An object that exists purely for our use and convenience with no reciprocal relationship, no obligation to give back what we take. The waste problem is, at its core, a manifestation of that extractive world view. We produce, we consume, we discard, and we don't close the loop. The alternative here, closing the loop, or even just wasting less, is not complicated to understand. But it can be genuinely difficult to implement at scale.
Yeah. The thing that's coming to mind with that is just something else that Tucker said, was just doing our best to connect or to get closer to the cycle of life. Just whatever we can do to get closer to the cycle of life. So that is one thing we can do. And like, yes, it can be generally hard to implement at scale, but when we're thinking about individual action, how you feel wasting food, like you composting it and putting it back into the earth is you getting closer to that cycle. Now, I suspect some of you are sitting with the same question. If regenerative practices are better for soil, for water, for communities, for the climate, why aren't they the default? Why is the industrial system still dominant? Why haven't we fixed this?
It's
Great
almost
questions.
entirely economical. Spoiler, sorry. But inseparable from that, it's almost entirely systemic. We aren't going to go that deep right now because we will be giving you some policy things to consider next week, but let's at least give you a framework right now to work from.
The core tension is that typically regenerative and sustainable practices cost more to implement, especially upfront. Okay? They cost in labor, in management attention, in knowledge per acre. Industrial agriculture, rather, achieved its scale partly by replacing human knowledge and attention with chemical inputs, with machines. Regenerative agriculture, in many ways, requires more skilled observation, more attention, more adaptive management, more relationship, literally, with a specific piece of land. At a small scale, that's manageable. Recall the average U.S. farm is over 400 acres. Okay? At the scale of hundreds to thousands of acres, that's almost unmanageable for a single person. Kind of makes you think that even that part of the system needs to be reevaluated, doesn't it?
What a subtle foreshadowing, Ariana. Yeah, and also, like, if someone has a good way to picture how big an acre is in your mind, let me know, because every time we say it, I just picture Vermont. I'm like, yeah, 400 acres. That's got to be it.
Like Vermont, the state?
Yeah, because 400 acres seems like a
Okay.
lot, and Vermont's tiny.
Okay, so it's not Vermont. Okay. Did you ever go to my aunt's house? I can help you visualize this. Remember my aunt who lived on the lake? Her backyard is about an acre.
We'll come back to this. Because there's also a time issue, which we did talk about in episode 2, that moving from industrial to regenerative farming typically means 3 to 5 years of lower yields while the soil health rebuilds. That's if you're getting yields at all. And for a farmer who might be operating on thin margins, which most farmers are, that gap can be the difference between staying on their land and losing it. We talked about this with the dispossession of marginalized communities at the top of the episode. If you don't have the money to stay on your land, the government takes it. And asking farmers to transition without outside financial support is asking them to take an enormous personal gamble for a collective benefit. That's not a reasonable ask unless there is corresponding support, even a guarantee.
Yeah.
Might I throw in there?
And I just like to point out that industrial agriculture might be cheaper because they made it cheaper. Like they made subsidies accessible to industrial farms for producing certain things. They made like when you consolidate like that and you have like this monster monopoly controlling prices and what they do to their farms, like that they can control how that stuff gets produced and how they can actually like manage a farm. Regenerative farmers for the most part are operating solo or like with their family. So no, obviously like at a scale, like yes, regenerative farming looks more expensive, but that's because it's designed to that way. We can actually like use community force to change that. And industrial food is cheaper for a lot of the same reasons. There are real benefits to cheap food, obviously, right? Like price accessibility matters.
Yeah.
Especially for low-income communities. But industrial food is cheap in part because its true costs are not reflected in its price. Like I was just ranting about a couple seconds ago. The cost of soil degradation, the cost of water contamination from runoff, the cost of carbon emissions, the cost of antibiotic resistance, the cost of diet-related illnesses. All of these costs are paid by real people, but they are not paid at the checkout counter, okay? So when you think you're getting a deal, you have to pay that somehow down the line. They are pushed onto society, onto ecosystems, onto future generations. And we'll be sure to dive deeper into the policy levers that can help with this transition in a later episode.
We have covered a lot of ground today. But that's how you do a joke, Ari. Just kidding.
Bitch. All right, then.
Food apartheid and the geographic design of food access. Food sovereignty, and the right of communities to define their own food systems, the theft of land from Black and Native peoples, historic and ongoing, the hidden environmental costs of how we move food around the world, the staggering scale of food waste and the methane it produces, and the systemic conditions that generate it, and the economics of why practices that are better haven't scaled.
Yeah.
These are real problems with real consequences for real people. Today was about, what do they say when you're meditating? Notice and observe. Today is about looking at them clearly, right?
Exactly. Which I feel like is not so easy to do these days. It's hard.
There's a lot.
It's systemically been very carefully like veiled from everybody because they don't want you knowing all this ugly history about it. Okay, they don't want you to know all the ugly truth about how this is done.
It's uncomfortable.
Who wants that? We want butterflies and rainbows and distractions while these jerks go and literally ruin the world. Anyway, Our calls to action this week are light, not like the statement I just made. Not because there's nothing to do, but because the system changes take time, and these are small changes that impact the system immediately. So, 3 action items for the class today.
Number 1, support food justice organizations that are doing boots on the ground work. They need time, they need money, and amplification. Natives, we talked about them earlier.
Yeah.
The North American traditional indigenous food systems. They are one worth knowing about and supporting. They are linked in the show notes.
Number 2, reduce food waste where you can, okay? Not as a substitute for systemic change, as we said in today's episode, but as a practice of consciousness. Connect yourself closer to that cycle of life, in the wise words of Tucker Garrison. Buy what you need, cook what you buy, compost what remains. And when you do it, remember that you're pushing back in a real way against a system that profits from treating food as disposable.
Finally, share this podcast with at least one other person.
Dead ass.
Yeah, this is not self-promotion, contrary to what it sounds like. Systems are not laws of nature. They are human constructions. They were built by specific people, making specific choices in specific moments. And that means that they can be challenged, deconstructed, and rebuilt. But we are stronger together. So making more people within your circle aware of this movement helps us create that energy to move systems in a different direction.
Alrighty. Next week, we zoom in. We will be bringing it down to the community and the person, because here's the good news. We can fix this. Here's Grace and Zion to give us some words of hope and power.
It's wrong. It's wrong to allow communities to suffer in this way and leave all of this responsibility to the communities to uplift themselves. However, that's kind of how it has to be sometimes. Unfortunately, we have to be so fed up that we change the status quo, and we have enough people fed up that we make that change. There's a lot of important things that need to be done, and I think it's so unfair that we have to take a lot of these matters into our own hands. But ultimately, we are the ones that are empowering each other, and whatever greater entity that holds all this money or whatever ain't compared to our our need and our extreme desire to take care of ourselves and one another.
The marathon of effort to preserve beautiful food, and so grateful that we're among so many brilliant, beautiful souls who are here on the planet right now, who are so committed and who are so wise and who are so just clear in what power we do have. We're coming to see that in 1 acre of well-loved, well-tended land, with multiple hands of people and community support and, general sense of how to tend to it, that there can be an outpouring of abundance, right? Just in 1 acre, you can produce an incredible amount of food that can feed so many people. Each year, there can be an improvement on the land. There can be an increase in the nutrient density, in the mineral density, in the water holding capacity, in the biodiversity, in the microbial diversity. That's why we're doing the work we do. We were out working in the field today, and we were noticing how with 2 people doing something, we got so much more done than if either one of us approached the same task and were attempting it on our own. That as soon as there's another person who joins in, that what comes is exponentially greater. And so the more of us who team up and make our interventions, then we do have a exponentially cascading potential to transform the environments that we live in.
The system is broken, but systems are built by people, and they can be rebuilt by people. And that's not optimism, folks. That's just fact.
Thank you for listening, residents. We'll see you next week. Hotel Earth 360 is written and produced by Ariana Halvai and Alexandria Moorhead, with contributions from Perry Kaler. It would not be possible, however, without the profound shared knowledge of Indigenous communities. Interviews featured in this episode include Grace Johnson, Tucker Garrison, Zion Davidson, and Cole Rainey. This episode was edited by Bob. Find us on Substack, at HotelEarth360.com, YouTube, and wherever you listen to podcasts.